Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Kat Prince, who's going to be our presenter for today. She is the Wisconsin Pollinator Conservation Specialist for Xerces Society. And she basically helps people create habitat for pollinators and other beneficial invertebrates on their farms and in their gardens and their properties. She spent many years working in science and sustainability. She's guided a lot of school groups through tallgrass prairies. She's helped people battle invasives, and she's worked on organic farms. She's got a master's degree in entomology and agroecology from our own Madison, UW-Madison. And she's just such a delight to be around. I really admire her passion for these tiny critters, and I just can't wait to hear what she has to share with us. When you're done listening to her today, you might want to go back and read her beautiful, I mean, really beautiful guest blog that's on the WeWick website. So thank you so much for being here, Kat.
Thank you, Chris. I'm gonna share my screen and hopefully that works. All right, can you all see a PowerPoint? Good.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, yeah, so I'm Kathryn. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with Xerces here in Wisconsin. And if you haven't heard of us, the Xerces Society is a nonprofit that puts invertebrates and their conservation at the forefront of our work. And if you're wondering why invertebrates, although in this crowd maybe not, invertebrates are really important because they are the majority of animals. And that's true whether you're counting by species or by sheer weight. This is a graphic comparing an estimate of the weight of all humans on the planet versus all arthropods. We're outnumbered. So you can't be invested in biodiversity without including invertebrates in that biodiversity. And that's what we do. Our name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is a butterfly native to California. This is not a picture of the Xerces blue. This is a picture of our own Carner blue, endangered species here in Wisconsin in the upper Midwest. There are some differences, obviously, between the two, but the main difference is that the Xerces has been extinct for almost a century. It's believed that this is the first insect to go extinct due to human expansion and urbanization in the United States. So we have taken its name in the hopes of preventing this sort of extinction from happening again. And our work falls broadly into four buckets. We do scientific research, education and training, workshops and webinars like this one, policy and advocacy work, and a lot of on-the-ground conservation, which is what we're going to talk about today, or at least the planning aspect of it. So, when I do a habitat plan, or when really anyone does it, regardless of who you're working with or if you're doing it on your own, they generally start with the same couple of steps. And the first step is to identify your assets. So this would be what you already have on your site. And when we say site, we can be referring to a farm or a forest, a prairie, a backyard, honestly, even an apartment patio. Whatever your starting point is, get out there and see what you've got. Now, your assets can be bad things or good things. So, for example, if it's a bad thing, that would be something like erosion. This is an example of a farm that's got a major erosion problem that they would probably want to list as one of the things they've got going on. But it could be things like invasive species infestations, or as good things, the gold standard is maybe you have a prairie remnant that's been hanging on for the last 100 years. But that doesn't have to be what you have. I mean, maybe as long as some sort of animal or plant or something is using your site at some point, that's an asset. So you can list that when you're trying to figure out where your starting point is, because once you have your starting point, then you can move on to the second step, which is identifying your goals. So this is, now that you know what you have, what do you want to increase? What do you want to maintain? And what do you want to get rid of? So, when I have these conversations about pollinator habitat or invertebrate habitat with people, I tend to notice a pattern that people usually want to start by asking, where do I put it? And I think this might be putting the second step in front of the first step. So you've probably already got habitat that you can focus on improving rather than starting from scratch. And the other reason I discourage starting with this question is that I don't think that habitat needs to be thought about as decorative or as a set aside, or in the case of a farm, some land that you have to sacrifice from production in order to have invertebrates, because and habitat like this can be incorporated everywhere. So really the first point is to start by inventorying your assets and learning how to look for it, putting your pollinator glasses on, so to speak. So when you're inventorying for what kind of habitat you already have, you need to consider what insects need. As an aside, we're going to be talking primarily about terrestrial invertebrates today. So if you came for aquatics, this planning does relate to that, but I'm going to be focusing my content on terrestrial invertebrates. So anyway, consider what the insects on this site might need. So I have a list here of all the different things to look for, and if you memorize this list, you'll be able to go out there and figure it out. Number one, food. Number two, shelter. That's it. That's the list. So once you know how to find those things in the wild, you'll be able to get started figuring out where your baseline is. And what those things look like in the real world can be a little bit different. So let's start by doing a closer examination about invertebrate food. Now, the obvious superstar here would be flowers. Flowers provide food for invertebrates, especially pollinators, by way of pollen and nectar. So these are things that the insects are either consuming directly at the flower, or, as famously is the case with bees, they're taking away from the flower and using to provision nests to further the future generations of pollinators. So as a rule of thumb, I generally recommend people have at least 3 species in bloom all year throughout the growing season. So 3 in the early season, 3 in the late season, and 3 in the mid-season. Obviously, more than 3 is also good, but as a starting point, to get a bunch of diversity out there and have activity all year, that's a good one to shoot for. Another thing about flowers is that after they're pollinated, they tend to become fruits and seeds, which is really great not only for invertebrates, but for all the animals using a habitat feature. So including flowers is quite important. Now, food can also be host plants. And these are sometimes flowers, but not always flowers. And this one, sometimes people struggle with a little bit because it goes against our gardening credo. What I'm asking you to do here is plant plants specifically so that bugs will eat them. And this is important especially for the caterpillars of moths and butterflies. A lot of these insects are very host dependent. So their host plants can be only a specific group of plants or sometimes even only a single species. So the famous caterpillar host plant relationship that we probably all know is the monarch butterfly. The monarch caterpillars need to live on some sort of milkweed species in order to reach adulthood successfully. And milkweeds are also flowers and pollinator plants in that they are producing flowers that the pollinators as adults can then visit. But not every host plant does this. Host plants can also be grasses or sedges or trees. And the traditional thing we think about when we think about host plants is probably a caterpillar munching on leaves, but they can look a little bit different too. So this picture on the left, you've probably seen this if you've walked in a prairie in winter or late summer. This is a goldenrod gall. So this is a different kind of host plant relationship. There are a few different kinds of animals that make these galls. This one was made by a fly. So basically what happens is this fly comes and it lays its egg on this goldenrod, and it also changes the goldenrod's DNA so that it makes a gall, and then the larva lives inside of that gall and it overwinters there. So this is an interesting one because not all of our birds migrate in the winter to go farther south. So sometimes you'll see chickadees in the winter that are visiting these galls and plucking out those juicy larvae. So having host plants is really important for birds because the vast majority of songbirds and really most birds, as far as I know, will feed their young insects, regardless of what they eat later on in their life stages. Those first few days or weeks are really fueled by caterpillars. So having a lot of different host plants to attract caterpillars is really going to help with your bird populations as well. Now, in talking about plants, there is a difference between native plants and non-native plants. So, for example, here are two habitat plantings that are both really colorful and attractive to look at, but the one on the left is all native plants to the upper Midwest. And the one on the right, as near as I can tell, does not have any native plants in them. Now, as far as human enjoyment goes, I'd rank them pretty close together. But as far as what wildlife is going to use, it's skewed very heavily towards the one on the left. So natives are an important thing to include in your habitat features for a couple reasons. Number one, these are plants that have adapted to the conditions here and have lived here in some cases thousands of years, and they've formed relationships with the other animals and plants that are here. So they're part of a food web. If you take a plant that's not from this area and plop it into the middle of a new place, it doesn't have those connections and relationships, and it tends to not be as useful as part of the food chain. Now, the other thing is some of these horticultural varieties have skewed pretty far from the wild type, which is as close as you can get to what you'd find in nature. So when you're breeding a flower for human enjoyment, you're tending to focus on traits like flower size and color. Um, but a plant only has so many resources. So you're taking those resources and funneling them all towards size and color. You're doing so at the expense of the other resources. So we're getting flowers sometimes in these horticultural varieties that come out that don't even have pollen and nectar, or their nutrition value is pretty low. Um, so not necessarily, especially in a garden setting, needing to only plant natives, but including them is very beneficial for wildlife because wildlife have those relationships. Okay, so that's plants, but in terms of food, you also need to have prey around. And this is a critical one if you have a farm too, or a garden where pest populations will show up. Those predators are going to come and eat the pests for you, but they need to eat something when the pests aren't in your crops. And that's where having an alternative source of prey comes in. Another interesting thing, some pollinators are also predators at different life stages. For example, the syrphid fly. This is a picture of a flower fly or a syrphid. They're these cute little flies that are pollinators as adults, but as young, they are voracious predators of aphids. So you can see this little blob guy on the left over here is sucking the juice out of an aphid that it found. And it's actually not even the only predator pictured here. One of those aphids is all puffy and brown. It's a mummy, we call it. It's got a parasitoid wasp inside of it, which will eventually emerge kind of like alien-like later on in the season to go parasitize more aphids. So having alternative sources of prey is very important for these animals to be able to complete their life cycles. And just so you know, pollinators can also be prey. At first glance, this may be a pretty yellow flower, but at second glance, it's a spider hiding on the flower, waiting for an unsuspecting pollinator to come in so it can grab it and eat it. This particular kind of spider, the crab spiders, tend to be pollinator specialists, and they are really beautiful because they're colored to match the flowers that they hide on. So you'll see a lot of yellow and white ones. Some of them even have a little bit of pink. But you don't get these predators that are higher up the food chain unless you have all those other links connecting so that they have something to eat. All right, so that's food, but the other thing we need to provide is shelter. And shelter can look like a few different things. One of them would be nesting places. So this is especially important for native bees. We have maybe 30% of our native bees will use dead wood for their nesting material. And by dead wood, I mean things like snags, so standing dead trees, logs, brush piles, or the hollow stems of different plants. And this is a pretty easy one to get if you don't already have it, maybe with the exception of a snag. But yeah, you can just have a brush pile, or if you're doing gardening, just a few little tweaks to what you're doing are going to make really good shelter for stem nesting bees. So instead of cutting everything down to the ground for your winter cleanup, leave some stems high, like 8 to 12 inches, or leave everything standing over the winter. And then, and this gets really hard in the spring, resist the urge to clean it up for a long time. We're talking like maybe April or May, maybe even into June if you can, and then allow the plants to have any insects that are inside of them hatch and complete their life cycle before you take them out of the environment. You'll have more populations of stem nesting bees if you do it that way. Additionally, soil is really important. Um, so the majority of our native bees are soil nesting species, but a lot of other animals will make their nests in the soil as well. And then we have this whole other suite of animals that I'm only going to touch on today that spend their entire lives in the soil. And they're so tiny and they're so submerged that chances are you will never encounter them, even though they're there under your feet. And soil is the basis of terrestrial life. It's what makes healthy plants, and healthy plants are what make healthy species of animals that use the plants. So having robust soil health with a lot of invertebrate biodiversity is going to really help the overall landscape. This is also where we can sequester a lot of carbon, which helps as we get more carbon in the atmosphere. So generally, a little bit of exposed soil is actually a good thing. And this, especially in a garden setting, can be relevant for if you're doing a lot of heavy mulching, like wood chip mulch that you apply every single year. I generally recommend against that. Although I will say I love wood chip mulch for the early stages of a pollinator planting. It's really good as weed suppression. So when I'm advising people to do plug plantings, I generally will say to use the wood chip mulch at the beginning and then just let it biodegrade. It'll add organic matter to the soil. And then eventually the insects will be able to access the soil again after the plants are established. And the plants too can then move around because it's hard for them to recreate more plants with seed if there's a thick layer of mulch in the way. So having exposed soil and having healthy soil that is not disturbed frequently is really good for invertebrate habitat. And also physical structure. This one's pretty easy because they just need things like places to hunt or perch or hide. And sometimes it's just as easy as like having a stick or a grass stem. But maybe one of the most useful physical structures for you to have at a site for invertebrates is leaves. Maybe if you've heard this sort of a tongue twister rallying cry of, let's see if I can say it, leave the leaves. Yes. So leave the leaves is basically a call for not raking up all the leaves that fall at the end of the year, especially the ones that are directly underneath trees, because a lot of insects will be dropping from those trees and they use those leaves for protection to hide from predators and for insulation over the course of the winter. Because, I mean, we know monarchs migrate south and a lot of our birds do, but most of our insects don't. They stay here and they have to find a way to get through our tough winters. And leaves provide a lot of the insulation for them to do that. So having areas where you still have leaf cover is important for a lot of the animals that use that as it decomposes to provide organic matter for them and for shelter. Like fireflies, for example, which is what's pictured over here on the left. That's a immature firefly. They spend their first part of their lives in and around the soil, and leaves are pretty important for sustaining firefly populations. So that's physical things you can look for in terms of shelter, but shelter can also be things that you're protecting your invertebrate habitat from. And one of these is light pollution. So really, it's been pretty recent that we've been learning how damaging night lighting can be to nocturnally active animals. And maybe part of that is because this is a new thing. Like even 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, we didn't have lights at night like we do now. Like your grandparents, or at least your great grandparents, didn't have the same access to electricity that we do now. So they had a very different night sky in that they could probably actually see the stars in a city. So these lights are having effects on animals that maybe we didn't realize were going to happen. For example, did you know that most of our migratory birds migrate at night? And artificial lights can disorient them on these long distance journeys. And then the classic example is moths. They'll flock around these lights and just go in circles over and over again until they exhaust themselves to death sometimes. And that's because they have these physiologies that are very finely calibrated to flying and navigating in very low light conditions. And all of a sudden, in the last 100 years, and especially in the last 20 years, things have just gotten really bright for them. And it's been difficult to adapt because they've had to take thousands of years to get to where they are. And in the course of a century, it isn't enough time to be able to adapt. So when you're looking at outdoor light pollution that could affect your invertebrate habitat, there's two things to keep in mind. One of them is brightness. It's pretty self-explanatory how bright it is. I think that's wattage, maybe. But the second one is also important, and that's wavelength. So there's different kinds of light. There's long wavelength and short wavelength. So red light is more long wavelength, and this is more like what a campfire would put out. And then short wavelength is more blue, and this is closer to the UV spectrum, and it's more like what you'd see during the day. This is also the kind of light that you sometimes we hear about in the news with people being like, don't look at your cell phone screen right before bed because it'll affect your ability to sleep. That's because of the blue light. So if it's that bad on a tiny cell phone in a bedroom, this is also light that we're blasting out into nature. And it's too bad because LED lights are the ones that are more efficient and they've been marketed so as the economical and earth-friendly alternative for a while. But that wavelength of the light that they're putting out has actually been quite detrimental. So if you're looking for ways to reduce light pollution, especially if it's your lights, you have a lot of options. If you have the more energy efficient LEDs, there are filters you can get to lengthen that wavelength and make it more akin to red light, so it's less jarring. You can also replace it with bulbs that are less bright. Or shielding is a big thing. So if you have a light that's exposed on all sides, you're getting a lot of non-target light versus if you're lighting a path, you really only need it to point downwards. So having light that points mostly downwards will be really good for night flying insects. And then if you don't need lights on at night, don't turn them on. Or if you do feel like you need them on, consider getting a timer or a motion sensor so they're not just on all night when nobody's out there. This is an example of, I think, a hotel that did a before and after of changing out their lights to make them more wildlife friendly. And you may notice one of these also looks like it would be a whole lot easier to sleep the night through at. And it's the wildlife friendly ones. So changing out your lights can also change out your ability to sleep and other diurnal animals that may be exposed to this light. So that's one kind of protection. And this is the other one, pesticides. So you probably knew it was coming, but invertebrates and pesticides don't tend to mix well in terms of having healthy populations. So there's different ways that invertebrates can be affected by pesticide. First, direct sprays. So this is a pretty easy one to avoid. If you have flowering habitat, don't spray it directly with insecticide or herbicide. But it's the indirect methods that invertebrates can be affected by pesticide that can be a little bit trickier to avoid. So this would be something like, for example, in the upper Midwest, we grow a lot of corn and soy. And most of our soybeans, and I think probably all of our corn, come pre-treated with a seed coating. And this seed coating contains a lot of different things, but more often than not, one of those things is an insecticide. So not all insecticides are the same level of damaging to insects. The ones that you really need to watch out for are compounds that are broad spectrum, which means they don't have a specific target insect. They're effective to many different kinds of insects, including pollinators and other ones. And then also systemic. So these are insecticides that are uptaken by a plant and they're throughout the plant's tissue. So neonicotinoids are the ones that are a little bit infamous for being both of these things that have caused some non-target effects to pollinators and other invertebrates. So the corn seeds that may have these seed coatings that contain neonicotinoids, as they're planted, the farmer's not actively spraying neonicotinoids all over the landscape, but as they're getting planted, the dust from these seed coatings can escape from the farm equipment, and then it gets carried by the wind and it travels. So some researchers have been finding habitat in natural areas that have never received insecticide treatments. They have insecticide residue there, and the invertebrates are being exposed to it. Another thing, after they're planted, they the compounds can get into the soil and they degrade in the sunlight, but if they don't touch sunlight, they don't degrade quite as quickly. And sometimes they get into the groundwater and then they can be uptaken by plants farther away. So this can be a little bit tricky to avoid if you're not the one using the insecticides. Generally, space can be your friend, so trying to prevent uh, having that dust off happen or the drift by having as much space as you can between where you know these applications are occurring and where you want your habitat to be. Or sometimes you can block drift with physical features like a wall or maybe some evergreen shrubs that aren't going to be attractive to pollinators, but will be able to block a lot of that drift from coming onto your property. Those are also beneficial for blocking your neighbor's lights, by the way, evergreen shrubs. Um, and sometimes you might even be using them without realizing it. So, for example, if you have a wildlife food plot that you're using treated seed in, that could be getting some of these non-target insecticides onto your landscape as well. So, if you're not sure whether your seed has a treatment, a good way to tell is if it's fun neon colors, it's probably been treated. But also look at the packaging and read the labels on the back of your bags. And if you're not sure, you can ask your vendor. And if they're not sure, you can ask if they can give you some seed that hasn't been treated. Another way that you may accidentally be getting some of this treated plant materials is sometimes at big box stores, the plants will be pre-treated to prevent insect damage, which, as we know, is actually the sign of a good habitat feature. But it's not something people generally like to see in stores. So sometimes there will be signage, sometimes there won't. Again, if you're not sure, it doesn't hurt to ask because the more vendors hear that people don't want these systemic broad spectrum treatments of insecticide on their products, they may start offering more options for people who don't want that. Um, so if you have a compound you want to look up, and this is true, like whether or not something is conventional or organic, different insecticides or herbicides or fungicides are of different levels of toxicity, and sometimes they interact. So you can look them up with this tool that I actually use pretty frequently. This is something put out by the University of California called the Bee Precaution Pesticide Ratings Tool. Um, I think you can just Google that too, and it's usually one of the first things to come up. But basically, you can put in a pesticide either by its trade name or by its chemical name, and it'll give you a rating of one, two, or three based on how toxic it is to pollinators specifically, but you can rather infer that to other invertebrates. So I recommend this tool to people, and that's a QR code that will take you to it if you'd like to play around with it and check it out. Okay, so that is the basics about how to identify assets for invertebrate habitat on your site. So once you get out there and do it during the day and during the night, so you can really see it at all times of day, um, the next step is deciding what your goals are going to be. So this is, I think, a little bit more fun, and you can get pretty creative with this because invertebrates can do a lot of things for us in terms of providing ecosystem services. For example, seed dispersal, pollination, of course, both of crop plants and of wild plants, pest control, and that includes livestock health. This is a picture in the center of a dung beetle. These guys are really important to have out on pastures for cycling those cow pats or livestock manure into the ground before populations of damaging flies can build up. So having uh, a lot of dung beetles is good. And speaking of soil, like we mentioned, soil health is really important for terrestrial life. Invertebrates are a big part of that soil health. And they can provide a lot of benefits that way as well. And of course, they're very important food for wildlife, especially caterpillars. But that's just the ecosystem services. Like you can think beyond that too. I feel like maybe our modern culture doesn't put enough value on beauty, but that's absolutely a valid reason to make a pollinator habitat planting. If you want to look at flowers and you like the way they smell, that's definitely a goal. Another one, and this is the cool one that people are starting to do more economic analyses of, is entomotourism. which is basically people traveling to wild places to see wild bugs do bug stuff. A famous example of this one is the fireflies of Appalachia. People will go out there and they'll see the blue ghost fireflies or the fireflies that all blink at the same time in the forest. And it makes big money for these rural communities because not everyone has fireflies. But you know what? We have fireflies. So maybe if you have like a farm stay or an agritourism venture, that can be a selling point to come and see the fireflies. Um, and I also don't know if you guys know this, but we have monarch overwintering sites here in the United States, in California. So these are places where people go to see the monarchs, and they don't need a passport. And sometimes there are festivals, and they can do Thanksgiving counts to monitor the population with citizen science. So a lot of cool opportunities in the entomotourism department. But just be aware that over-tourism is also a thing. So if you have a resource that you'd like to share with the public, just make sure that the sharing you're doing doesn't end up degrading that resource. And speaking of sharing, now we can finally get to that popular question of where do I put it? And there are some divergent thoughts about this in the agroecological literature. It's the debate of land sharing versus land sparing. So I'll go over those two, and you can think about what might work well for your site. Number one is sparing. So this is the concept that preserving intact habitat with human development happening around it, sometimes intense human development. And if that's the case, it creates something of an island of habitat. And traditionally, this is how our culture has framed habitat creation. So one example is, again, in California, the redwoods and the sequoias. At the time of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, these old growth forests were being clear cut. But there were some people in different places that wanted to preserve some areas. So now we have places like Muir Woods and Yosemite, so people can go and visit these. And the reason that people did this at the time was primarily for people. So the concept of extinction was not widely accepted as possible at this time in human history. So people were intentionally preserving habitat to share with other people for the beauty aspect rather than for animals using it. But it's given us some incredible places. But land sparing is also getting a little bit harder to do. Land, as you probably know, is getting more expensive, and there are more people now than there ever have been before. And it also can have its drawbacks. For example, in California, in these redwood and sequoia groves, the concept was very much hands off, let it do what it wants to do. But for thousands of years before that, that was not how these forests were being managed. The people living there were using them as part of their everyday lives. So, in that sudden shift in the last 100 years of people not doing any more management, a very thick understory has started to come in. And in preserving it by not touching it, they actually changed it. And now, when fires come through, they're actually much more severe. But you'll notice in this after picture that thick understory is gone. So just be aware that preserving something without human use isn't necessarily the best way to do it. Um, okay, so let's talk about the flip side of that, which is land sharing. So this is incorporating habitat into human spaces and making the degree of human development less intense. But it does tend to be less valuable as habitat than a pristine forest preserve or unused habitat. So we see this concept in regenerative agriculture, which is the notion that farming can improve the land rather than only extract from it. And we see this in some of our solar fields that are experimenting with low-growing pollinator plantings so that wildlife can use them. We see this in sustainable grazing practices, where people are moving the livestock through so that they don't overgraze in any one place. And if you were wondering, yes, you can. It is possible to graze native species of grasses and flowers. And we also see the sharing happening in urban spaces, in homes and office parks and gardens where people are including native plants that will harbor habitat for native animals. So, of the two, which one is better? This is where the debate gets kind of silly because we need both. We actually do need both. We need places that are conserved for habitat and for human enjoyment, but we also need places in between where the people are to connect these set-asides and return wild spaces to our daily lives. So sharing our spaces has a lot for us to explore because if we have only islands, it's not as useful for animals. We need them to be able to connect to each other. Because again, invertebrate habitat is already everywhere. This cornfield is incredible invertebrate habitat. If you happen to be a corn pest, I mean, it's miles of no predators, your host plant right there. The predators don't have their own habitat, so they're not there, or they've been sprayed outright. But this is probably not the kind of invertebrate habitat that the farmer was hoping to create. So instead, with a land sharing sort of model, we can have habitat that is more intentional, that looks more like this, where we have a diversity of plants that include flowers with pollen and nectar, a diversity of host plants to support specialists, physical habitat features like leaf litter, snags, and plant stems, and maybe most importantly, an ecologically sound system that doesn't rely on external inputs that will allow populations of predators to subsist beyond the boom and bust cycles of crop pests. So um, hopefully you are feeling inspired to get out there and start habitat planning. And if you do, I know there are a lot of great organizations doing work in these areas. And I encourage you to see what all is out there. And I can point you into some resources you can use from Xerces in the meantime. So one of them is our native plant seed and services directory. So if you're interested in acquiring plants or seeds, or you want to hire a contractor to do it for you, this is something that you can search by state and find local providers in your area. And if you happen to be one of them and you find yourself not on this list, send me an email or fill out the form and we will add you to it. We also have pre-made plant lists based on region. Here's a couple from the Great Lakes region. So if you're not really sure which plants you should be planting or what to look for, you can take one of these lists, they're free, and try some of those species. They're broken up by soil type and the kinds of animals that they provide habitat for. They're a really great place to start. And then this one I'm very excited about. If you happen to be in Wisconsin and you're a farmer or a community food initiative, we have a program for you. It's called the Pollinator Habitat Kit Program. So basically what this is people who are interested in doing a pollinator habitat planting get in touch with me and we work together to make it happen. So Xerces provides the plants for free and the technical expertise, and the farmer provides the land and the labor to plant it. And then together we create pollinator habitat. So if anyone is interested in that, feel free to get in touch with me. As I said, I'd love to talk to you about it. And if you're not in Wisconsin, we do have this program happening in a few different states. So you can check and see if there's one happening in your state. And I think we have a link to the Wisconsin program in the chat. So speaking of which, this is my email. If you have any further questions about this, if we don't get to any today, or if you want to learn more about the KIT program, feel free to reach out. And with that, that's what I have. But I just wanted to thank you all for being interested in invertebrate habitat and for attending today. And I think we might even have some time to talk.
Yay. Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was incredible. I think people were riveted because we only have a couple questions in the chat, but I do want to invite folks that are on the call to, pop them again in the chat if something is coming up for you, or raise your hand and come off mute. But we had one question that was asking about the urge to clean up in the spring. Can you cut dry stems and lie them in the garden? Will the bees still hatch? Like, what are the best practices for that
Oh, yeah.
vital period of the season?
We actually have a little infographic of that I probably should have put in my talk and then I didn't. But generally, just like if you have to cut them a little bit, just leaving that 8 to 12 inches standing does some good stuff. Because once they fall over, then they can get wet and start to rot. So yeah, I recommend like if you have to do a pre-winter one, just keeping the stems longer and then just it's really a hold yourself back for a little while in spring until things are starting to green up and then finish cutting it out.
Cool. Thank you. And another question, and I saw that Xerces has a resource for this. I'll put it in the chat, but I didn't see it answered. What is like the lifespan of neonicotinoids? Like how long do they persist in soil, water, etc., if you're, rehabilitating land or anticipating runoff or things like that?
Just putting my email in the chat because I should have left my slide up and I didn't. Yeah, so it's one of those things where it depends. So their persistence when they're exposed to sunlight is actually not too long. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, and sometimes it depends on the formulation. In terms of in plant tissues, it's generally like if you're talking about a seed coating, it'll be taken up, and the seeds and the seedlings are very, very like high concentration. And then as the plant grows, the concentration will dilute. And when you get to the point where they produce flowers, generally we don't actually see a lot of concentration in the flowers themselves. So as far as seed coatings go, it seemed like it was going to be a great alternative, but then the whole drift thing from the coatings themselves became an issue. And then when they're not exposed to sunlight, they can persist longer, but it kind of depends on environmental conditions.
Um, does the Wisconsin Habitat Program require a certain number of acres to participate or any restrictions to participation?
Yeah, we don't have a minimum size. It's kind of geared more towards small scale for people who have a small area or who want to dip their feet, or maybe something that is like too small to be eligible for some of the federal programs. So generally, the seeded projects that we do are 2 acres. We might have enough funding actually for some of them to be 3 acres this year. And then the plug plantings, just because the insane amount of labor it would take to do like a whole acre of a plug planting, we usually limit those to 2,000 square feet or less. But people are also welcome to reapply over subsequent years.
I'm just over the border. Do you have programs for Illinois farmers?
Uh, not this one,
Not
but we do
yet.
have the plant
Okay.
resources. Not yet.
Well, again, I'll be the first customer. Um, let's see. Oh, how far can different orders of inverts travel to isolated habitats? I'm assuming connectivity is ideal.
Mhm. Yeah, the more connectivity, the better, because even if you can travel really far, it's probably pretty exhausting to get there. This is something I know more about with bees, where the rule of thumb is like the bigger the distance between their two wings on that middle segment, the farther they can fly. And I think some of the bigger bees can fly as far as 5 miles, which, by the way, is the reason we don't have an organic certification for honey in the United States because there's just no way to make sure that those bees are not flying all those miles away to reach things. But yeah, generally the smaller it is, the farther or the less far it can go, especially for the central place foragers, which have like kind of a radius they forage around with bees versus butterflies are more like, oh, I just go where I want. And there's some dragonflies that they migrate and span continents. So it depends.
Amazing. I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. We probably have time for one more before we close out our midday amazing chat. Kathryn, anyone?
There's a question from
Oh,
Emily Clark. What time of year is best to begin preparing a site to create a native habitat?
Yeah, so generally there's 2 ways to do native habitats, at least that I mainly work with, which is seeding and plugs, which are the little tiny live plants that you buy. And the more time you give yourself, the better. It kind of, another one, it depends on how bad your weed infestations are. So if you have a site that maybe like was just in soybeans and you want to plant some seeds into it, you're not going to have to do much site prep because that's pretty weed free. versus you have a whole Canada thistle patch, you might need a couple years to get that one ready. But I recommend people start, once the soil is workable, to do like different things to get it ready, and then you can plant live plants in spring and in summer, and seeds generally go down in the winter, so somewhere between November and March, which are also the windows for our Habitat Kit program in Wisconsin. If you're thinking about doing one this summer or this winter, we have some funding available still.
Fabulous. Well, we see a lot of appreciation in the chat. Thank you so much. Chris, do you want to again share the next webinar that's coming up? Thank you.
Yeah, I can't say thank you enough. That was amazing. I can't wait to rewatch it. I think a lot of us will want to watch it again. Just as a reminder, we do have a playlist. You can go on the website, wewic.org, and hit webinar replays and watch all of these again. It will take us a week or so to get it up. But here's what we have coming up. Invertebrates in the pasture, grazing with bugs. We have Karen Jokala, and she's also from Xerces, and then Kristen Zumo from National Audubon Society. So that's going to be, I know a lot of you will be interested in that. And then I'm super excited to learn about night pollination with Emily May. So those are very exciting coming up. I hope you'll sign up and join us for those. Just a reminder that we would love to have you on the listserv. It's not the same as the newsletter. The listserv is just an organic list where we all ask each other questions via email. So to get on that list, info@wewic.org, just send a message saying you want to be on the listserv. And remember our action alert. If you can make it on the 23rd, you can do either a Zoom or come in via your phone. You'll hear about NRCS, then you'll be split into these regional areas to talk about what you think priorities should be for USDA in those areas. And that's all we've got. Thank you so much for being with us.